The vampire. Blood rains down. The city dies in agony. The vampires rise and the world falls apart. The city of Silver Hollow was bustling, alive, until it wasn't. It started with the disappearance of Emily, a young woman, just another face in the crowd. She lived alone, worked late shifts, and never bothered anyone. Until the night she walked home and into the waiting darkness. Her apartment was a mess of empty takeout boxes and coffee cups, her feet dragging along the floor as she worked into the early hours of the morning. She left her building, earbuds in, music blaring, unaware of the predator following her. The alleyway behind her was dark, the only light a flickering lamp above. Her heart was racing, but not from fear. She was used to the routine. The night was familiar. Then she felt it, the cold. The unnatural chill that crawled over her skin, a tingling sensation that prickled her neck. She stopped and spun around. There was nothing. The air grew thicker, and just as she was about to take another step, something shot from the darkness, gripping her throat with a vice-like hold. Her scream was cut short by cold, fanged teeth sinking deep into her neck. Her blood rushed out in torrents, her vision blurring, her chest tight, her body losing its strength. She fell to the ground, her limbs flailing weakly as the creature drank from her. Her veins collapsed, her pulse slowing until nothing. The creature stepped away, eyes glowing like red embers. A man-sized shape, its skin pale as death, its lips stained with crimson, its fangs dripping with fresh blood. It was still hungry. The streets around her rippled with darkness, and the hunger was spreading. The next day, the first body was found. A woman in her early 20s, her neck torn apart, her face frozen in a permanent scream, her body drained. By the end of the week, the city streets were covered in blood, the bodies piling up like discarded refuse. The police tried to manage it, but they were only feeding the flames, watching as they grew worse. A city that had been so vibrant, so full of life, was now swallowed by an insatiable darkness. By the time the city realized the scale of the nightmare, it was already too late. The vampires had torn through everything, devouring the weak and turning the strong. The hospitals were filled with patients who didn't stay dead, their wounds stitched together, their throats gaping open, their lips cracked into grotesque grins. A nurse tried to run, but the hallway was filled with shadowy figures, pale faces, glowing red eyes. One of them lunged forward, fangs sinking into her flesh. Her last thoughts were a prayer for mercy, but it was too late, and then they came for the rest. The vampires controlled the city now, moving through the night, hiding in plain sight. The government issued a quarantine, but it was already a joke. A handful of soldiers went in, loaded with weapons, thinking they could cleanse the streets of the bloodthirsty monsters. The first batch of soldiers never returned. The second batch was found disemboweled, their limbs torn apart, their faces chewed away. By the time the sun dipped low, the streets were silent. The vampires were everywhere, hiding in every shadow, watching, waiting. And the few remaining survivors had nothing left but fear. A group of civilians locked themselves in a church, holding weapons, guns, knives, anything they could find. They thought it would protect them. They were wrong. The door burst open with a crash. The vampires were there, swarming. There was no time to scream. There was only the sound of ripping flesh, snapping bones, and the sickening slurping as teeth tore through flesh. The blood flowed freely, and within minutes, the survivors were gone, their bodies strewn across the church, their insides eaten alive. At midnight, something stirred. Something ancient. Something far more terrible than any vampire that had ever been made. The master had been awakened. From the ruins of the old cathedral, a figure stepped into the city. Twisted, enormous, with a body made of shifting shadows and bone, eyes burning like hellfire. Its mouth was a black void of fangs. Its skin was like thin, cracked porcelain, and it was covered in the blood of hundreds of thousands. It smelled of rot. The master was not merely a vampire, it was the nightmare. The darkness incarnates, and its hunger unforgiving. It stood above the city like a god, its voice a rumble of the tortured souls it had consumed, calling to the others, "Come, come and feast." And the vampires obeyed. There were no survivors left. No real hope. The military had died in waves, and the last civilians had been picked off one by one. Their screams echoed in the streets, but no one was left to hear them. The master had devoured them all, and the city had become a blood-soaked battlefield. Every building was littered with dismembered corpses, every corner was soaked with blood, and every street was covered in the remains of the fallen. The vampires now owned the city. The last of the survivors, a small group holed up in a forgotten bunker, could only watch as the vampires patrolled the streets, searching for their next meal. One by one, the survivors fell to the ground, their bodies pulled from the safety of their hiding places and torn apart. There was nothing left now. The master stood in the heart of the city, staring down at the destruction. A single drop of blood dripped from its fangs. It had won. The streets were still, the buildings empty, and the air thick with the scent of death. The vampires had spread across the entire city, their hunger an endless abyss. No one was left to stand against them. The master's reign had begun. It would spread, slowly, inevitably, until the world was nothing but a pint of blood and darkness. Where the vampires would rule alone, there would be no salvation.